It started with a fence line that shouldn't exist and a quiet letter that never should have been ignored. One morning, sunlight hit my inherited land just wrong, and I realized something massive had changed while no one was watching. What stood beyond the hills wasn't a mistake. It was a takeover. And the people responsible believed power erased ownership. Stories like this don't end the way bullies expect. If you believe in justice, consequences, and watching unchecked authority finally crack, subscribe now. Because this isn't just a property dispute. This is about karma arriving slowly, legally, and with receipts. The ranch had always been quiet in a way cities never understand. 900 acres of inherited land stretched across rolling hills, dry creek beds, and long wind-bent fences that carried history instead of polish. It was the kind of place passed down without ceremony, more responsibility than reward, and left alone because it didn't need attention to exist. For years, it remained exactly that. Unnoticed, unbothered, untouched. Until the day it wasn't. The first sign came as paperwork, not noise. A notice slipped into a stack of mail that looked official enough to be ignored by someone who trusted the land to stay where it was. It mentioned zoning improvements, community expansion, and infrastructure development. Nothing alarming at first glance. Nothing that suggested a threat. It was written in language designed to calm, not warn. Weeks later, tire tracks appeared where grass had grown undisturbed for decades. The ranch sat outside city limits but inside ambition. That distinction mattered more than most people realized. Developers saw opportunity where families saw legacy. The Homeowners Association nearby had been growing aggressively, expanding its borders like a slow-moving tide. New roads appeared. Decorative stone entrances rose from dust. Streetlights crept closer to the property line. Still, no one asked permission. By the time construction noise echoed across the hills, the assumption had already been made. They assumed the land was abandoned. They assumed the owner was absent. They assumed silence meant surrender. What they built wasn't subtle. At the far edge of the ranch, where the terrain leveled and views stretched endlessly, concrete foundations were poured. Framing rose. Steel beams caught the sun. What followed was not a home but a statement. A mansion-scale structure with glass, balconies, and manicured access roads carved directly into land that did not belong to them. They called it a community centerpiece. It was financed, permitted, and marketed without ever addressing the deed holder. The ranch owner learned the truth standing at a fence that had been relocated overnight. A new boundary marker gleamed where rust once lived. Survey flags cut through wild grass. A locked gate stood where open land had always been. Beyond it, luxury took shape with absolute confidence. This wasn't an accident. It was strategy. The HOA operated with the belief that authority expanded itself. Their documents were thick, their legal teams well-funded, and their confidence unshakable. They believed that by the time anyone objected, the cost of reversal would be too high. That ownership could be drowned under progress. That a single name on an old deed couldn't stand against a corporation-sized committee. They underestimated one thing. Land remembers who it belongs to. The mansion reached completion in record time. It featured sweeping stonework, imported materials, and landscaping that ignored natural contours in favor of dominance. It was marketed as an amenity, a meeting space, a symbol of success. Residents paid dues believing they were buying into prestige. No one asked where the land came from. No one wanted to know. When the ranch owner finally walked the perimeter with updated survey maps, the truth became unavoidable. Over 60 acres had been taken. Not leased. Not negotiated. Taken. And the structure sitting on it wasn't temporary. It was rooted deep, expensive, and intentional. Legal letters followed. They were dismissed. The HOA responded with bureaucratic confidence. They cited development approvals, municipal cooperation, and implied consent. They spoke in language designed to intimidate rather than explain. The message was clear without being written. This was already done. Fighting it would be pointless. They believed the ranch owner would fold. Instead, silence returned. No public outrage. No threats. No social media spectacle. Just quiet documentation, patient filings, and a refusal to rush. While the mansion hosted events and meetings, a parallel process unfolded elsewhere. Deeds were verified. Boundaries reaffirmed. Historical land records surfaced with dates that predated the HOA by generations. Every inch was accounted for. The ranch owner didn't ask for demolition. They asked for rent. The demand was simple and devastatingly legal. If the HOA wished to continue occupying the land, they would do so as tenants. Monthly. Retroactively. At commercial rates adjusted for unauthorized use. The number attached to the demand wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. And it made panic unavoidable. The HOA laughed at first. Then the liens appeared. What followed was not chaos, but pressure. Financial institutions hesitated. Insurance providers asked questions. Potential buyers noticed disclosures. The mansion, once a symbol of control, became a liability anchored to a mistake no one wanted to claim. The ranch remained still. And the HOA realized, far too late, that they hadn't just built on land they didn't own. They had built on someone who knew exactly how to wait. The first cracks didn't appear in public. They showed up in closed meetings, behind polished doors where confidence used to sit comfortably. The HOA board had grown accustomed to control, to decisions that went unchallenged because resistance rarely survived long enough to matter. But this time, the resistance didn't argue. It calculated. The rent demand landed like a quiet bomb. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just precise. It outlined acreage, dates, unauthorized usage, and market-adjusted rates that reflected not residential land, but commercial exploitation. The figure attached to the notice was high enough to command attention and reasonable enough to survive scrutiny. That balance was deliberate. At first, the board dismissed it as posturing. They leaned on their lawyers, their development permits, and the assumption that courts favored progress over individuals. Their meetings stayed calm. Their language stayed dismissive. They believed the ranch owner was attempting leverage without teeth. Then their attorneys stopped sounding relaxed. Questions began arriving from places that never questioned them before. Title insurers asked for clarification. A lender flagged an irregularity tied to land ownership verification. The city requested supplemental documentation confirming easements that suddenly didn't align with older maps. Nothing was denied outright. But nothing moved forward either. Stagnation unsettled them. The mansion, once booked months in advance for events and association functions, now sat under an invisible cloud. Contracts included new clauses. Vendors hesitated. Insurance premiums quietly increased. Each change alone was manageable. Together, they created pressure. The HOA reached out. Their communication shifted tone but not intent. They framed the situation as a misunderstanding. They proposed retroactive authorization, symbolic compensation, and a boundary adjustment that would resolve everything cleanly. It was a familiar tactic. Offer just enough to appear cooperative without conceding wrongdoing. The ranch owner declined without commentary. Silence again. Behind the scenes, a different strategy unfolded. A forensic land survey was commissioned. Drone imaging documented encroachments with time-stamped accuracy. Historical county records were digitized, cross-referenced, and certified. The land wasn't just owned. It was provably intact through decades of uninterrupted documentation. Every step was deliberate. The HOA attempted to shift the narrative internally. They reassured residents that everything was under control. They framed the issue as a temporary administrative delay. But residents noticed things leadership couldn't hide. Financial statements grew heavier. Reserve funds dipped. Special assessments were whispered about, then discussed openly. Trust eroded faster than money. Residents began asking questions at meetings. Simple ones at first. Who owned the land? Why wasn't this resolved already? Why was the association paying lawyers more than usual? The board responded with polished vagueness, emphasizing complexity and patience. But confidence had begun to fracture. The ranch owner made no public statements. That absence became powerful. Legal proceedings advanced slowly, methodically, not as lawsuits, but as filings. Liens attached to the mansion property without spectacle. Notices of unauthorized occupancy entered public record. Each document tightened the situation while remaining invisible to anyone not looking closely. The HOA's options narrowed. They couldn't sell the property. They couldn't refinance. They couldn't ignore the accruing rent, which now surpassed figures that forced acknowledgement. The mansion was no longer an asset. It was a bleeding wound dressed in stone and glass. The board convened emergency sessions. Tempers flared behind closed doors. Blame circulated. Someone suggested reaching out directly, bypassing lawyers, appealing to reason. Another suggested drawing the conflict out until exhaustion forced compromise. But the math didn't support delay. Every month added zeros they couldn't explain away. The ranch owner finally responded. Not with anger. With an invoice. It detailed monthly rent, late fees, interest, and an offer that was as devastating as it was lawful. The HOA could continue occupying the land under a formal lease, or vacate and restore the property at their expense. There was no third option. No negotiation language. Just compliance paths. The invoice spread through the board like frost. They attempted to rally authority. They referenced community benefit, economic contribution, and implied political pressure. But every attempt at leverage met a legal wall. Permits didn't override deeds. Community value didn't erase ownership. And politics didn't matter when documents predated the city itself. The HOA was trapped by its own assumption. They had believed ownership could be overwritten by construction. That time and money created legitimacy. Instead, time had strengthened the ranch owner's position while money had exposed theirs. Residents learned fragments of the truth. Rumors spread faster than statements. Some demanded transparency. Others questioned dues increases. A few realized they were financially tied to a mistake they never consented to. The mansion, once marketed as prestige, now symbolized risk. The ranch owner watched none of this directly. They stayed on the land, walking boundaries that had always been theirs, listening to wind that didn't care about meetings or votes. The strategy remained unchanged. Let the process work. Let pressure build naturally. Let accountability arrive without shouting. The HOA sent one final letter that month. It requested a meeting. Not to negotiate terms. To ask how payment should be made. The power dynamic had shifted quietly, irrevocably. The association that once assumed silence meant weakness now understood it as certainty. They had built something permanent on borrowed ground without asking permission. And now, every square foot was charging them back. The meeting took place in the mansion itself, which felt appropriate in a way no one said aloud. The structure stood immaculate, polished, and imposing, yet its presence carried a new weight. What had once symbolized authority now felt like evidence. Every stone, every pane of glass, every landscaped path rested on land that had never been theirs to command. The HOA board arrived early, not out of eagerness but necessity. Their posture had changed. Voices stayed low. Confidence was replaced with calculation. They sat at a long table designed for dominance and decision-making, but the atmosphere no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the truth they could no longer avoid. When the ranch owner entered, there was no dramatic announcement. No entourage. No visible satisfaction. Just a calm presence that contrasted sharply with the tension filling the room. The landowner didn't need to raise their voice or posture. The facts had already done the work. The discussion remained strictly professional. No accusations. No threats. The HOA outlined their willingness to formalize a lease agreement, framing it as a mutually beneficial solution. They spoke of community use, long-term planning, and stability. It was an attempt to regain footing without acknowledging fault. The ranch owner listened. Then they clarified something the board hadn't fully accepted yet. This was not a negotiation over access. It was a reckoning over control. The lease terms were not a favor. They were the consequence of an unauthorized occupation that had continued for months. The rate reflected that reality. So did the conditions. The board shifted uncomfortably. They asked about flexibility, about future adjustments, about whether public acknowledgement was necessary. Each question revealed the same concern: image, reputation, control over narrative. The ranch owner's response remained consistent. Compliance would be quiet. Resistance would not. The lease was signed that day. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't announced. It was filed. The impact was immediate. Funds that had once gone toward expansion were redirected to rent payments. The mansion's operating budget ballooned. Maintenance costs now competed with monthly obligations that could not be deferred. The HOA's financial cushion thinned rapidly. Residents felt it next. Dues increased without explanation detailed enough to satisfy anyone. Budget summaries became vague. Requests for transparency were met with deflection. But numbers don't hide forever. Eventually, a resident accountant noticed discrepancies too large to ignore. Questions turned into demands. The truth surfaced piece by piece. The mansion wasn't owned. It was leased. Worse, it was leased from someone the HOA had taken advantage of. Residents who had bought into the community believing in careful governance now realized they were paying for leadership's overreach. Anger replaced confusion. Board meetings grew crowded. Voices rose. Trust evaporated. Some residents demanded resignations. Others demanded audits. A few demanded legal action against the very board that claimed to represent them. Authority fractured under scrutiny. The HOA attempted damage control. They issued statements emphasizing resolution and partnership. They framed the lease as a strategic agreement rather than a forced correction. But residents weren't interested in spin. They wanted accountability. And accountability required answers leadership couldn't provide without admitting wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the ranch owner remained absent from the noise. Rent payments arrived on time. Late fees were enforced when they weren't. The lease terms were honored precisely as written. There was no interference with HOA operations beyond what the contract dictated. The landowner didn't seek attention or validation. The agreement itself was enough. The mansion continued operating, but its role shifted. It was no longer a symbol of unchecked authority. It was a reminder. Every event held there, every meeting convened under its roof, occurred at the discretion of someone the HOA once dismissed. That reality settled slowly. Board members resigned quietly, some citing personal reasons, others citing stress. New elections were held under scrutiny that hadn't existed before. Candidates campaigned on transparency, humility, and reform. The community demanded leaders who understood limits. The ranch owner watched this from a distance. The land itself remained unchanged. Wind still moved across the hills. The fences stayed where they belonged. The mansion, for all its grandeur, was just another structure resting temporarily on soil that outlived ambition. The HOA requested one amendment months later. They wanted to explore purchasing the land outright. The request was denied. Ownership wasn't for sale. Not out of spite, but principle. The land had been inherited with responsibility, not profit as the primary motive. Leasing preserved control while teaching a lesson that couldn't be undone with money alone. The HOA adjusted. They learned. Slowly, painfully, publicly, they learned that authority granted by paperwork doesn't override authority earned by history. That power assumed without consent eventually collapses under its own weight. And that silence, when backed by truth, is louder than any threat. The mansion stood unchanged, but its meaning had transformed. It no longer represented dominance. It represented consequence. And for the first time since construction began, the HOA truly understood where they stood. On land that was never theirs. The aftermath didn't arrive with lawsuits or sirens. It arrived with spreadsheets, resignations, and an unmistakable shift in tone throughout the community. Power didn't collapse loudly. It thinned. It drained away through obligations the HOA could no longer outrun. The lease changed everything. What had once been a long-term vision for expansion turned into a month-to-month calculation for survival. The HOA's budget, previously padded with optimism and growth projections, now had a fixed expense that never went away. Rent wasn't symbolic. It was substantial, indexed, and unforgiving. Every payment was a reminder that authority had limits, and they had crossed them. The board tried to adapt. They froze non-essential projects. Landscaping contracts were renegotiated. Amenities were scaled back. Promised upgrades quietly disappeared from planning documents. Residents noticed. The community that had sold itself on prestige now found itself trimming basics to sustain a building it didn't own. Frustration simmered. New board members inherited a mess they hadn't created but couldn't escape. Transparency became their rallying cry, but transparency exposed wounds rather than healing them. Financial disclosures revealed how much had been spent defending an indefensible position before the lease was signed. Legal fees, consulting costs, and emergency meetings had drained reserves long before rent ever did. The community demanded accountability. Audits were commissioned. Committees formed. Old decisions were scrutinized with a harshness that hadn't existed when expansion was the priority. Every document tied back to the same assumption: that no one would challenge them. That land without a visible owner was land without resistance. They were wrong. The ranch owner didn't attend hearings, didn't testify, didn't appear in newsletters or community forums. Their influence was felt without presence. The lease spoke for them. The deed spoke louder. Meanwhile, the mansion itself became a paradox. It was used constantly, yet admired cautiously. Residents held meetings there while resenting the cost. Celebrations took place under a roof that reminded everyone of leadership's failure. The building had become unavoidable, physically and financially. Some residents questioned whether it should be abandoned. The idea gained traction briefly. Vacate the property. Stop the bleeding. But feasibility studies crushed that hope. Restoration costs alone would rival years of rent. Breaking the lease would trigger penalties worse than staying. The HOA had built itself into a corner. The ranch owner understood this. That understanding was the quiet power behind everything. They hadn't demanded destruction. They hadn't chased headlines. They had allowed the HOA to choose the least painful option available. And in doing so, ensured the lesson lasted. Time passed. The HOA stabilized, but never recovered its old posture. Meetings became cautious affairs. Language softened. Decisions slowed. Expansion plans were shelved indefinitely. The culture shifted from dominance to compliance, from assumption to verification. Residents adapted too. They became more engaged, more skeptical, less willing to accept authority without explanation. The incident became a reference point, spoken about carefully, often without naming names. A reminder that governance without restraint carries consequences everyone pays for. The ranch remained untouched beyond the leased acreage. That distinction mattered. The owner didn't restrict access unnecessarily or interfere with operations. They maintained distance and consistency. The land outside the mansion stayed wild, undeveloped, and free. It contrasted sharply with the controlled environment of the HOA, reinforcing a truth that didn't need to be spoken. Ownership isn't about control alone. It's about stewardship. As years passed, the lease became routine. Payments were automated. Late fees became rare. The shock faded, but the structure remained. New residents were informed during onboarding. Disclosure statements included clauses that had never existed before. Transparency, once optional, became mandatory. The HOA's reputation changed externally. Developers looked elsewhere. Municipal partnerships slowed. The association was no longer seen as aggressive or influential. It was seen as cautious. Some called it weakened. Others called it wiser. Either way, the era of unchecked expansion had ended. The ranch owner received occasional inquiries. Offers to purchase the land resurfaced during market booms. Each was declined politely. The value wasn't just monetary. It was symbolic. Selling would erase the lesson. Leasing preserved it. The mansion aged. Stone weathered. Glass dulled slightly. Landscaping matured. It blended more into the land, losing the sharpness of new ambition. The building became just another structure, not a statement. And that was the final irony. The HOA had built a monument to power and ended up financing a reminder of restraint. Every dollar paid reinforced the truth they once ignored. That ownership cannot be assumed. That silence is not consent. That legacy outlasts ambition. The ranch owner never needed to raise their voice. They let time, law, and patience do what confrontation never could. They proved that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives monthly, on schedule, documented and unavoidable. And the HOA, forever changed, learned that the most expensive mistakes aren't the ones fought in court. They're the ones built in stone on land that remembers who it belongs to. Time did what confrontation never could. It settled the situation into permanence. The HOA no longer reacted to the lease with panic or resentment. It became part of their reality, folded into budgets and board agendas as something unavoidable. But acceptance did not mean forgiveness, and it certainly did not mean forgetfulness. The community changed in subtle ways. Residents who once trusted glossy brochures and confident presentations now read documents carefully. They asked questions early instead of complaining late. The culture of blind approval faded, replaced by a quiet insistence on proof. New proposals were dissected. Boundaries were verified. Authority was no longer assumed to be correct by default. That shift mattered more than any payment. The mansion continued to operate, but its role softened. It stopped being advertised as a crown jewel and became simply a building the community used because it existed. Events moved elsewhere when possible. Some residents avoided it altogether, uncomfortable with what it represented. Others saw it as a reminder that accountability, though costly, was still possible. The ranch owner observed none of this directly. Their life did not revolve around the HOA's adjustments. The land demanded attention in its own ways. Fences needed maintenance. Seasonal changes altered the terrain. Wildlife followed patterns older than any association. The ranch was alive in a way buildings never could be, and that life carried on without regard for meetings or minutes. Occasionally, representatives reached out. New board members introduced themselves with cautious respect. They spoke differently than their predecessors, choosing words carefully, aware of history. The ranch owner responded politely but briefly. The relationship was defined. There was no need to renegotiate boundaries that had already been proven. The lease did its work quietly. Rent payments accumulated into something substantial over time, but money was never the primary victory. Control was. The ability to decide what happened on the land, when, and under what terms remained exactly where it belonged. The HOA understood that now, fully. The surrounding region took notice. Other associations slowed expansion. Developers became more diligent. Municipal planners referenced the situation indirectly in meetings about zoning and oversight. The story traveled without headlines, carried through professional circles as a cautionary example of overreach corrected by patience. The HOA's internal politics stabilized. Elections became less theatrical. Candidates avoided grand promises. Instead, they emphasized stewardship, restraint, and responsibility. Residents rewarded that shift. Participation increased. A community that once deferred now engaged. The mansion aged into the background. What once stood out as bold and intrusive now blended with the landscape, softened by weather and time. The land absorbed it in its own way, surrounding it with growth that neither asked permission nor needed approval. Nature reclaimed influence where authority once tried to dominate. The ranch owner reflected on none of this publicly. Their silence remained intentional. They never framed the outcome as victory. They never spoke of justice or revenge. They understood something the HOA learned too late. True leverage doesn't need performance. It only needs endurance. Years passed. The lease was renewed without discussion. It was no longer controversial, just expensive. The HOA had adjusted its scale to match reality. Expansion was no longer the goal. Sustainability was. Some residents eventually forgot why the payments existed. They accepted them as part of community life, like utilities or maintenance. But institutional memory persisted. Documents were preserved. New board members were briefed. The mistake was never erased, only contextualized. The ranch remained whole. Outside the leased acreage, the land stayed undeveloped, its value growing quietly alongside market shifts. The owner received new offers, increasingly aggressive, increasingly lucrative. Each was declined with the same calm certainty. Ownership wasn't about maximizing profit. It was about honoring inheritance. The HOA came to respect that. What began as resistance evolved into understanding. Not friendship, not partnership, but acknowledgement. They had crossed a line and learned from it. That learning shaped everything that followed. The mansion, once intended to symbolize dominance, became a lesson carved in stone. A reminder that progress without consent is trespass. That authority without humility invites correction. And that land, unlike people, never forgets who holds its name. The ranch owner never needed to remind them. The payments did that. Every month on schedule, the HOA reaffirmed the truth they once tried to ignore. They paid not just for land use, but for the education that came with it. An education that reshaped leadership, culture, and community expectations long after anger faded. The lesson endured because it wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. And consistency, like land, outlasts ambition. The reckoning did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded quietly, spread across years rather than days, embedded in routines so ordinary they almost went unnoticed. That was its power. What the HOA once feared as catastrophe had transformed into something more permanent and far more instructive. The association learned to live smaller. Not in acreage, but in attitude. Decisions that once sailed through on confidence alone were now slowed by verification. Surveys were double-checked. Legal reviews were mandatory, not ceremonial. Consultants were questioned instead of trusted outright. Expansion, once the defining goal, became a cautionary word spoken only after long pauses. This was not humility born from goodwill. It was humility born from memory. Every board member who joined was given the same orientation, a quiet briefing that explained why certain line items could never be removed from the budget and why certain parcels of land were discussed with particular care. No speeches were made. No names were emphasized. The facts were enough. The mansion still stood at the center of the community, but its energy had changed. It no longer projected authority. It absorbed it. Meetings held inside were quieter, more procedural. Applause was rare. Arguments were structured. Decisions were documented with an almost obsessive thoroughness. The building had become a courtroom without a judge. Residents felt the difference even if they couldn't articulate it. The community moved with restraint. Projects took longer. Promises were fewer. But stability replaced spectacle, and for many, that trade-off felt worth it. The ranch owner remained unchanged. They didn't capitalize on the HOA's caution or attempt to leverage it further. They enforced the lease exactly as written and no more. When payments arrived, they were processed without comment. When occasional delays occurred, penalties were applied without emotion. The consistency reinforced the lesson more effectively than any confrontation could have. Ownership does not need to perform. Over time, the HOA's financial strain eased slightly, not because the rent decreased, but because expectations did. The association recalibrated its identity. It stopped trying to impress outsiders and focused inward. Maintenance replaced expansion. Preservation replaced ambition. That shift stabilized the community. New residents arrived unaware of the past, drawn by quieter promises and realistic amenities. They inherited the consequences of decisions they never witnessed, but they also benefited from the caution those consequences instilled. The HOA functioned better under constraint than it ever had under excess. Still, the past was never far away. Occasionally, someone would ask why the association didn't simply buy the land. The answer remained the same. It wasn't available. Not at any price. That fact alone spoke volumes. It reinforced a boundary more powerful than any fence. The ranch itself thrived. Seasons moved across it uninterrupted. Rain reshaped gullies. Grass reclaimed areas once cut back for access roads. Wildlife returned to patterns broken briefly by construction noise years earlier. The land healed in its own time, indifferent to human timelines. The leased acreage remained distinct, maintained, regulated, monitored. The contrast was visible even from a distance. One side ordered, the other organic. One governed by schedules and invoices, the other by weather and patience. Together, they told a story without words. The HOA never challenged the lease again. They understood that doing so would invite scrutiny they could no longer afford. Compliance was not submission. It was survival. And survival had taught them more than victory ever could have. The broader region absorbed the lesson too. Development proposals faced tougher questions. Associations consulted land records more carefully. Municipal planners adjusted review processes subtly, influenced by a situation they never officially referenced but clearly remembered. The ripple extended beyond the ranch. All of it traced back to a single assumption. That silence meant absence. The ranch owner had allowed that assumption to exist just long enough to expose its weakness. They never corrected it prematurely. They let construction proceed. Let confidence harden into certainty. Let the mistake become undeniable. Then they responded. Not with anger. With documentation. Years later, the HOA marked an anniversary quietly. Not of the mansion's opening, but of the lease's signing. It wasn't celebrated. It was acknowledged. A note in the minutes. A reminder to future boards of the cost of arrogance. The ranch owner was never mentioned by name. They didn't need to be. Their presence was embedded in the system itself. In every policy. Every cautious vote. Every survey ordered twice instead of once. They had reshaped governance without ever governing. That was the true reckoning. Not punishment. Correction. The HOA learned that authority is not self-generating. It must be granted, earned, and constrained. When it forgets that, it invites correction from forces far quieter and far more enduring than committees or councils. The mansion stood, still impressive, still functional, but no longer intimidating. It had been absorbed into the landscape of consequence, where power exists only within defined limits. And the land, patient as ever, continued to remember. Not the mansion, not the meetings, but the name on the deed that never changed. By the time the 7th year passed, the story no longer felt dramatic to those living inside it. That was the final transformation. What once carried tension, anger, and risk had settled into routine, and routine stripped the illusion of power down to its truth. Power leaves traces. Not monuments, not slogans, but habits. The HOA's habits had changed permanently. Every decision now carried an echo of the past, a quiet reminder that authority could be challenged, corrected, and contained. The association functioned, but it no longer expanded blindly. It no longer assumed compliance. It no longer mistook momentum for ownership. The mansion remained the most visible reminder. Not because it was grand, but because it was unavoidable. It stood at the center of the community, used weekly, maintained meticulously, yet emotionally distant. No one spoke of it with pride anymore. It was practical, necessary, neutral. The building had been stripped of symbolism by time and consequence. That neutrality mattered. When structures lose meaning, they stop inspiring fear. And when fear disappears, authority has to justify itself through competence instead. The HOA learned to do that, slowly, sometimes painfully, but consistently. Residents trusted process now, not personalities. Board members rotated more frequently. No one stayed long enough to grow unchecked. Ambition became suspect. Caution became valued. Transparency was no longer a campaign promise. It was an expectation. The ranch owner observed none of this directly. Their life remained anchored to the land, not the association. They didn't attend meetings or read newsletters. The lease functioned as designed, requiring no oversight beyond what was written. Ownership didn't demand attention. It demanded consistency. That consistency reshaped the balance. The HOA no longer feared the ranch owner. Fear implies volatility. What they felt instead was respect rooted in predictability. They knew exactly what would happen if terms were violated. They also knew nothing would happen if they weren't. That clarity created stability. The surrounding region continued to change. Property values rose. Development pressures increased. Other associations formed and dissolved. But the ranch remained untouched beyond the leased portion, a constant against shifting markets. It became a reference point, spoken of quietly by planners and developers who understood what restraint looked like in practice. The land didn't advertise itself. It didn't need to. Occasionally, new HOA members stumbled upon old records and reacted with disbelief. They questioned how such a mistake could have happened. How leadership could have assumed ownership without confirmation. The answer was always the same. They believed silence meant consent. That misunderstanding became institutional lore. A cautionary tale repeated without embellishment. No villains named. No heroes celebrated. Just facts preserved exactly as they occurred. The ranch owner's name appeared only in legal documents. That absence from narrative protected the lesson from distortion. It prevented personalization. It kept the focus where it belonged, on systems, not individuals. Time did the rest. The mansion aged further into the background. Repairs replaced upgrades. Maintenance replaced expansion. The building became functional infrastructure rather than a statement of intent. It served meetings, storage, events, and little else. And that was enough. The HOA no longer tried to define itself by what it built. It defined itself by what it avoided repeating. That shift, subtle but profound, was the true legacy of the conflict. The ranch owner remained unchanged. They never reclaimed the leased acreage. They never escalated terms. They never sought publicity or validation. They let the lease exist as a boundary and a reminder, nothing more. In doing so, they demonstrated a form of power rarely recognized. The power to stop. The power to hold ground. The power to let others adjust to reality without forcing them to collapse. As years passed, residents who had once been angry softened. Younger families moved in without context. The community stabilized into something quieter, less ambitious, but more grounded. Fewer promises were made. More were kept. The land continued to exist beyond all of it. Wind shaped it. Rain fed it. Time preserved it. The ranch did not care who governed nearby neighborhoods or how often boards changed. It had seen authority come and go before. It would see it again. What mattered was that this time, authority learned. Not through loss alone, but through endurance. The HOA had built a mansion believing permanence could be purchased. Instead, they learned permanence had already existed, waiting patiently, documented, inherited, and unyielding. That realization reshaped everything they touched afterward. Power, when unchecked, leaves scars. But power, when corrected, leaves discipline. And discipline, unlike dominance, lasts. The final chapter of the story did not arrive with an ending anyone announced. There was no ribbon cutting, no court ruling broadcast, no triumphant reversal of fortune. Instead, it arrived the same way it always had, quietly, predictably, on schedule. With a payment. Every month, without exception, the HOA sent rent for land it never owned and would never control. What began as a forced correction became a permanent arrangement, woven so deeply into the association structure that removing it would have required dismantling everything built around it. The rent was no longer shocking. It was foundational. And that was the point. The HOA had learned to operate inside limits. Its leadership no longer dreamed in unchecked expansion or symbolic dominance. Instead, it planned in margins, contingencies, and verifications. It had been reshaped not by collapse, but by constraint. The kind of constraint that doesn't disappear when leadership changes. The mansion still stood, solid and impressive, but stripped of narrative power. It no longer represented victory, ambition, or control. It represented a reminder, silent, constant, and impossible to ignore. Every meeting held inside its walls took place on borrowed ground, governed by an agreement no one dared question anymore. The ranch owner never reclaimed the structure. They never needed to. Ownership had already done its work. The lease ensured the HOA remained aware, month after month, of the boundary they once crossed. The landowner didn't need to appear, speak, or intervene. The system functioned exactly as intended, reinforced by consistency rather than force. Years passed. Board members came and went. Residents moved in and out. Economic cycles rose and fell. Through it all, the lease remained unchanged. It outlasted personalities, reputations, and ambitions. It became institutional memory written in legal language instead of stories. The ranch beyond the leased acreage remained untouched. That contrast grew sharper with time. On one side, schedules, budgets, and rules. On the other, open land shaped only by seasons and patience. The difference wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. One existed because people allowed it. The other existed because history had already decided. Eventually, even resentment faded. What remained was acceptance. Not because the HOA agreed with how things unfolded, but because they understood why they had. The mistake had been clear, the correction unavoidable, and the outcome permanent. The ranch owner's role was rarely discussed. Not out of fear, but respect. They had never escalated beyond necessity. Never exploited vulnerability. Never chased recognition. They had enforced ownership exactly as written and nothing more. That restraint earned acknowledgement even from those who once believed authority belonged to them. The final truth settled slowly but completely. Power is not what you build. Power is what you can defend without raising your voice. The HOA had built a mansion believing construction created legitimacy. They learned instead that legitimacy begins long before concrete is poured. It lives in records, boundaries, inheritance, and patience. And when ignored, it waits. The rent kept coming. Not as punishment. As proof. Proof that land does not forget. That silence is not surrender. That confidence without consent eventually pays for its assumptions. And that justice doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives monthly. Documented. Enforced. Unavoidable. The story ended not with loss or victory, but with permanence. A permanent reminder etched into budgets and minutes. A permanent boundary respected at last. A permanent shift in how authority understood itself. The HOA moved forward wiser but diminished. The ranch remained unchanged. And the land, as it always had, outlasted everyone.